Thank you so much for listening to the Haladin Music podcast series on the Baroque era. My name is Sarah Joy, and today's episode, episode number 7, is actually the second to last episode in this series, and I will be talking about two very influential composers of this time period, which was roughly between 1600 and 1750. We will be talking about the lives of Monteverdi and Vivaldi. Now, before we get started, I do want to let you know again that Haladin created a lovely Spotify playlist that has all of the pieces that we've played so far through this podcast in complete form. So instead of just hearing little snippets from the podcast, you can listen to the full recordings on that Spotify playlist. Okay, so Monteverdi. Monteverdi was born in 1567. He was an Italian composer as well as string player. And what's really interesting and unique about his life is that he lived and created during the transition time from the Renaissance period to the Baroque period. So if you wanted to really understand that transition, you could just listen to Monteverdi's music, specifically his madrigals. He published 9 books of madrigals. The last one, book 9, was published posthumously. But through those, you can really trace the change from the older style to the newer style. His career began in Mantua in 1591, where he was a court musician for the Gonzaga dynasty. He was first employed as a madrigal singer and viola player, and then became maestro di cappella in 1602. So during this time, specifically 1607, he wrote Orfeo, which, if you remember, I talked about, I believe in episode, I want to say 4, I think it was episode 4. Orfeo was pretty much the first opera with mass appeal. It was the first opera to really gain a lot of success and popularity, and one of the main reasons for this is because Monteverdi was so creative with his arranging and instrumentation. He was able to really bring to life each individual scene through these unique uses of instruments. So instead of just having the same instruments playing the same parts through the whole thing, he would put them in unique groupings to really highlight the overall mood of the scene and bring it to life on stage. Also, during this time, he began to experience some backlash from the proponents of the older style, also known as prima pratica, the older practice of composition, which was all about very strict counterpoint. One of the main critics of Monteverdi was Giovanni Maria Artusi. Artusi had actually published a book condemning younger composers for their disrespect of the older style in pursuit of the newer style, also called seconda pratica. Monteverdi's madrigals, a few of them, I actually don't know how many, were included in this book, where Artusi criticized them for basically being clunky. He didn't really agree with the way that Monteverdi and some of these other younger composers were using voice leading, for example, how they would use and approach harmonies. I could get into more details on that, but I don't think we have time for that in this podcast. Basically, Artusi felt that they were disrespecting music and the older style of writing. Monteverdi's response was fairly roundabout, but in essence, his response was, Monteverdi was trained thoroughly in the older style, and any decisions that he made that were a break from that, they were not accidents. But that's one of the things, honestly, that I really love and respect about Monteverdi's works, is that he was so willing to experiment and explore new territory, new musical ideas. During his time in court, there were some strained relationships. He wasn't being financially compensated, perhaps as much as his worth as a musician deserved. And so finally, he did apply to be the maestro at the Basilica of San Marco in Venice. Now, this career in Venice started in 1613 as director of music at St. Mark's Basilica, and his responsibilities in this position, they were to recruit and train to compose music for church feasts, and to basically just build up and grow the church's collection of repertoire. He loved this new position. They gave him so much freedom. He was very well compensated. He was able to take on extra commissions outside of this primary position. So he really enjoyed he really enjoyed his time there. Now, some years later, he started encountering some fairly difficult life events. I don't know where I read this, so maybe fact check me, but I'm pretty sure I read that one of his sons actually was targeted by the Inquisition. I think everything turned out okay, but you can imagine that that would be fairly stressful for a parent. So it was things like that and some political upheaval that perhaps affected his creativity during this time. His composing, his work kind of slowed around this time period. But another thing that I just think is so interesting about his life is that once he got past that time, in his later years, he became prolific again. He was making very significant contributions, a few of them. So he published his 8th book of madrigals. He published quite a lot of church music, reworked an earlier opera. And I think that that is honestly fairly unique. You know, you see a lot of composers who would just kind of, things would drop off at the end of their lives. They would peak in their younger years, perhaps middle age. But I just find this example to be fairly inspirational. He kept going and he kept being creative and working hard right up until his death in 1643. So just a few last notes on Monteverdi's life. Again, his madrigals are a wonderful example of the transition from Renaissance into Baroque, transition from polyphonic writing into the use of basso continuo. His dramatic works, a lot of them disappeared, unfortunately, but Orfeo is one of the earliest operas that we still perform today, so that's very important. That's huge. And then he also composed a great deal of sacred music. So let's actually take a listen to some of his sacred music. I'm not going to pronounce this in Italian. I don't want to embarrass myself. So in English, we are going to listen to some of his litanies of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Vivaldi. Vivaldi was born in 1678. He was an Italian composer and violinist, a contemporary of Bach and Handel, and he was known as the Red Priest. Now, he gained this nickname because of his red hair and because he was ordained in 1703. So what's unique about Vivaldi's life is that he spent many, many years as the music director for an orphanage in Venice. Again, I'm not going to try to pronounce this in Italian, but in English, the orphanage was called Hospice of Pity. Now, what's unique about this orphanage is that they had an all-female orchestra and choir, and these women or girls, they were very, very well trained. Thanks to Vivaldi, they actually gained a wonderful reputation, not only locally, but abroad. So he actually was first employed there as a violin teacher, and then eventually whenever the board of the orphanage, members of the board saw what amazing work he was doing, that's when they finally promoted him to full music director. Now in 1718, Vivaldi was appointed Maestro di Cappella for Philip of Hesse-Darmstadt's court in Mantua. Vivaldi worked there for 3 years, and during that time, he composed the Four Seasons as well as several operas. And we've already listened to, I believe, 2 or 3 movements from the Four Seasons, but I would encourage you to listen to all of it. Now, in a fairly depressing contrast to Monteverdi's life, Vivaldi's music near the end of his life started falling out of fashion. And this was, as I was talking about in episode 1, due to the constant appetite for new music, new material, new content, and all of that. So, not unique to Vivaldi. This happened to a lot of composers. But, he was still in his later years commissioned by European royalty. He was greatly admired by Charles VI. And in hopes of strengthening this relationship with Charles and, really achieving some financial stability, Vivaldi decided to move to Vienna. But sadly, Charles passed away right after Vivaldi moved to Vienna, and then soon after that, Vivaldi himself died in 1741. Unfortunately, he died in poverty, which it's so very sad, but today we can look back on his contribution during this time period and see what a great impact he's had on music history as a whole. So I would encourage you, if you are perhaps an artist in any way, to keep that in mind whenever you're creating, that even though perhaps by the end of your life or even now people may not understand what you're creating, you never know what could happen in the future. So I hope that that gives you hope, that even if your life does not quite end the way that you want it to, or perhaps if you're feeling discouraged about your own personal artistic contributions, if you create with excellence and you work really hard, who knows? There is certainly hope that there could be a resurgence. Perhaps someone could discover you after you're long gone. A few highlights from his life before we end. He is mostly known today for his instrumental works. And then I thought this was so interesting because growing up, I was always told that Bach would study compositions by copying the works of other composers, but no one ever told me, at least I don't think they did, who those other composers were. So apparently Vivaldi was one of them, and Bach studied specifically by copying Vivaldi's concertos. Vivaldi wrote operas between 1713 and 1739. And apparently they were very popular with Venice's theaters at the time because they featured his works. I'm pretty sure more than any other composers during that time period, so that's very impressive. He wrote oratorios, secular cantatas, sinfonias, solo or trio sonatas. And then he wrote around 450 concertos, which people like to joke that he wrote the same concerto 450 times. And there might be a grain of truth to that, but I say nonetheless it is very impressive. So let's take a listen to Vivaldi's Chamber Concerto in D major. This is the third movement, Allegro, and this specific recording is arranged for guitar, even though it was originally written for the lute. Alright, that concludes today's episode. Thank you so much for listening, and please stay tuned for our last episode, episode number 8.